Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stella Collins, and I've got the pleasure of hosting Dr. Julia Shaw again. Julia is a psychologist and is really interested in mind hacking, brain hacking, memory hacking. She works at South Bank University. She works, does a lot of consulting on sort of criminal psychology, and we had a really interesting chat a week or two ago about her experiences in the criminal court. And I'd just been on jury duty, so I was like full of, I want to find out more about what goes on when the jury gets sent out. She's written a great book which is about to be put into paperback, so I'm quite sure she'd be very happy to talk about that. And has another book on the way, I gather, which is about evil. So I'm sure Julia will share something about that in her talk. So can I ask you to welcome Dr. Julia Shaw?
Great to be back. So today I'm going to talk about memory hacking. I hear you learned earlier today that stories are really important. You're going to hear a lot of stories in my talk. I love stories. So memory hacking. So memory hacking essentially is the idea that we can change what people remember. And we can do that intentionally. And not just in terms of learning, which is, of course, one big application, but also in terms of your personal past. So we can actually change who people think they are. We can change people's sort of most important memories about themselves. And that's what I do as a scientist, is I memory hack. I bring people into the lab, and I convince them that they did things that never happened. So that's my background. And I apply that to the criminal justice system, where I show that there are lots of problems with how eyewitnesses are questioned by police, how suspects are questioned, interrogations, maybe military applications, going away, coming back with reliable information. There's lots of different spaces where it's really important that you remember events accurately. And in learning, of course, it's also really important you remember information in general accurately. So there's a bit of an intersection there that I will explore for the next hour-ish. But before we begin, very foundational, what is a memory? What is a memory? I could go on and explain how memory, how your brain in general, is this cosmos, this universe that's ever in motion, that from one second to the next, your brain looks quite dramatically different when you look at the smallest scale. That if you think about how complex and infinite, really, the structure of your brain is, we will never possibly be able to understand it properly. But instead, I'm going to do this and say, how about we break it down and make it more useful? So that's all true, and your memory and your brain is a beautifully complex system. And everything I'm going to talk about is going to be a simplified version of science that's hopefully more useful, though, than talking about it in these big, grand terms. And so a memory, I argue, and other scientists argue, is a network. Memory is a network of brain cells, of neurons. And what you're trying to do when you're trying to learn something is you're trying to create a network that lasts. Right? You're trying to make a network, a memory that you can access later at will. Now, the thing is with this, since I've been here last, I've gone to, it's quite fun. I get to go to, well, Burning Man, places like that, if you know what that is, sort of music festivals and things like that. Right now, science is having a bit of a moment where we get to go to music festivals and talk about science, which is great. And so you actually get an artist pass. It says artist, and you feel like a rock star. Fantastic. Even though you're only talking to 5 people in the audience, doesn't matter. When I do this kind of thing, I like to get people to physically make a neural network. Now, what I do is I get people to either stand up or just reach over and hold hands. And the idea is that I want them to do this sporadically, and I come up, and they'll have this network, this random network that's generated, and I'll say, this is a memory. You are a memory. All of you who are currently holding hands, you are a memory. Now, I want you to forget something, and I come over and I split. I divorce 2 hands. Now you've forgotten something. This piece is now standing on its own. It's no longer connected to the network. That's what we call forgetting. Same thing happens in the brain. Now, if I ask you to misremember something, let's say you get something wrong. Well, what do? Is I maybe add someone, or I connect 2 parts of the memory that weren't previously connected. This is when maybe you get a name wrong. You know that there was a person there. Maybe you thought his name was Ed. Now you're calling him Sam. Suddenly you've added this misinformation. Maybe someone else has suggested to you, remember that guy Sam. And you go, oh yeah, Sam, even though that wasn't his name at all. The next time you're recalling it, you're talking vividly about this person you met, Sam. And so it's reinforced. So these these neural networks are flexible, and you can add to them and you can take away from them. And the adding to them is what I like to study, is that those extra pieces, those extra realities, if you will. How do you add stuff that wasn't there before? And in learning, this is really important, because that's how people can predictable mistakes. So you can see a classroom or a number of people you've trained in something, and you can see that they're consistently getting something wrong. It's not that they've forgotten that they've learned something about this issue. It's that they're getting it systematically wrong. And what I'm here to teach you is to help them not do that, and to help the neural networks be bigger and better and more stable. But before we go into how to make it better, I want to disabuse you of the notion that you even want a perfect memory. Now, I get this all the time. As a memory person, I'm sitting on an airplane or somewhere. The person next to me says, oh, so what do you do if I don't happen to have my headphones in and try to ignore them? What do you do? I do memory stuff. Oh, how do I get a perfect memory? I can't remember names very well. I'm not very good with faces. I'm not, whatever. And I go, well, I'm not really that person. I'm the other side. I'm the opposite of forgetting. I'm misremembering. But I also then say, why do you want to remember everything? Why do you want to remember every face you've ever seen? There are people who have really exceptional memory for specific things. One of these groups of people are called super recognizers. Now, supervisors are studied by Josh Davis, for example, who also works in the UK. And he has found, along with a number of other researchers, that there's a subset of the population that is absolutely exceptional at remembering faces. Just faces. They're not exceptional at remembering everything. They're just exceptional at faces, which is one of those abilities that most of us wish we had. They see someone 5 years later, they go, you were the guy in the line behind me at the coffee shop 2 cities over 5 years ago. Now, when you meet these people, or when you talk to people who are super recognizers, you go, well, that's great. I mean, in some ways I can't understand because I'm closer to prosopagnostic, so I almost am face blind. I can have an entire conversation with you that's in depth, and I'll see you at the hall the next day, and I'll refer back, oh, I had this great conversation with someone about X, Y, and Z. You'll go, that was me. And I'll just be referring back. At least I'm often hopefully complimentary, but I've completely forgotten your face, because that, to me, wasn't registering. But to these people, they register it. Now, face recognizers generally say that they have to pretend not to be great at remembering faces. Why? Because it's super creepy. If someone comes up to you and says, who you don't remember at all, you don't remember their face, you're not a super recognizer, they come up to you and say, 3 years ago I saw you in line at such and such. You go, why do you know that? Are you a stalker? Right? So it's really creepy to have this ability when nobody else does. And so generally they say that I need to hide this. And I maybe don't want it, because it's also all these faces that I don't need. There are also positive applications, of course, because, for example, the police currently are hiring super recognizers to go through video footage and to pick out people in different settings, really, different video footage. And super recognizers are much better at saying, oh yeah, that guy was in a tape I saw 5 days ago, and there he is again. And so they're actually helping the police, the Met in particular, currently solve crime. So there are upsides and downsides, but super recognizers often say, I kind of wish I didn't have this ability. So there's faces for you. What about HSAMs? HSAMs are people with highly superior autobiographical memory. Once again, highly superior autobiographical memory. HSAMs. Now, Jake is an HSAM. Jake is a kid who I met last year, who's about 12 years old. And he is studied heavily because there's not that many HSAMs. HSAMs are people who can remember in vivid and high amounts of detail things about their own lives, autobiographical details. They can remember what they had for breakfast in February on, I don't know, the 1st of February 1987. Maybe not Jake, because he's 12, but for the astonishing details that most of us wouldn't be able to remember. What the weather was like on a random day in your life. And here again, it's also surprising when you see, you go, wow, you have the best autobiographical memory that we know of in the world. And yet, what do they say? But I don't want this. Well, why don't you want this? What do you mean? Well, because I can remember every story. We repeat ourselves a lot, turns out. So life is a bit more boring. You also are really good at remembering all the bad stuff, which a lot of us are better at maybe glazing over and forgetting a bit. HSAMs remember the good and the bad. They remember everything. They don't have that kind of bias the same way. And so again, they're often saying, you know what, it's actually difficult for me to hold down jobs. It's difficult to have relationships. It might be maladaptive to remember everything about your own life. And we'll get to why that might be relevant and what that has to do with false memory. But HSAM, so there's these people who can remember so much, and they don't want it. Jake, great at remembering autobiographical stuff. Terrible at remembering pretty much anything else. So I don't know if you guys know who Bill Nye the Science Guy is. In North America, growing up, he's a pretty big deal for people who are into science. He's just a public figure who talks to kids about science. And Bill Nye was in the building when I met Jake. And Jake really wanted to meet Bill Nye, but he was too shy to go over. And I said, okay, well, it's back in the room where we were having dinner earlier. Well, we walk. It's a rectangle where we are, by the way, not a difficult building, just a square. We walk left, right, and he turns left. And I go, the room's right there, Jake. What are you doing? The simplest navigation didn't get it right. So kid with the best memory in the world can't find his way around a square. So it doesn't transfer. And this is what I wanted to say about HSAMs, is just because you have exceptional memory about one thing doesn't mean you have exceptional memory about anything else. There's also a correlation, as you may or may not expect, with autism. Yesterday I was giving a talk, and this guy in the front row was nodding along. And I was going, why is he nodding so much? And it was the first time he'd attended a memory talk. Turns out he's subclinical Asperger's, so he's on the spectrum. And he said, I remember too much. I'm probably an HSAM, and I hate it. And it was great to have this person self-identify. It was a revelation of, oh my God, it's not just me. So there's this connection with Asperger's, with autism, and sort of screening out lots of other stuff and hyper-focusing on things, and that's possibly why they remember certain things exceptionally well. Again, something that, to some extent, though, you want to harness. So it's still good for us to study these people and go, well, what are you doing that other people aren't doing? And how can we at least utilize this to remember certain things that we really need to remember? But what it all tells me, at least, is a story of how maybe your memory is meant to fail. Maybe it's made to fail. Maybe instead of wanting a perfect memory, maybe instead of saying, I want to remember these things perfectly, that's not what the goal should be at all. But it should be to optimize. We should remember the most important things. And that's what memory often tries to do. We remember the gist of conversations. We remember the take-home message. We don't remember all the steps in between because often they don't really matter. And our brains are cognitive misers. We try to use as few resources as we can to get as much output and as much adaptive information as we can. It's also made to imagine. Memory is flexible. It combines, it recombines. You have pieces that you correct that might be misinformation, they might be correct information. But either way, that's also just called learning, right? Replacing old memories or old information with new information. You might say, well, I've learned something and I've corrected my mistake that I was making before. So it's supposed to be flexible. And one of the byproducts of being flexible is that sometimes you make mistakes. It's made to imagine also possible futures. Because memory isn't really there, you could argue, so that we can sit there and reminisce and have lovely chats with friends about what we used to do in high school. Memory is there to help us navigate the now and the future. Memory is there to help us survive. It doesn't really care that you enjoyed, I don't know, Form 10. Is that a thing? Your GCSEs? I don't know, A-levels, whatever. That you enjoyed parts of your education. It's there to make sure that you don't die and you remember negative and positive things that can help you now. Well, it's made to predict. So we need to move away, I think, from this idea that, well, I need to remember things perfectly. No, you don't. And I think that's OK, and I think we can harness that. So meta-memory. Who knows what meta-memory is? Did you put your hand up? Yeah? Sorry? Yes, I did. What is meta-memory? Good. So just like metacognition is thinking about thinking, or being able to think about thinking, meta-memory is understanding how your memory works. So you have a level above the memory rather than just using your memory. You can think about and optimize how your memory works. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next, is meta-memory, some meta-memory skills. So memory can be hacked. So memory can be hacked in that I can convince you that you did things that never happened. But it can also be hacked in that you can make it better. So research that I'm referring to, if you were here last year, you heard some of this. This is what I focused on last talk mostly. I convinced people that they committed crimes that never happened. I'm basing my research on people like Elizabeth Loftus, like Kimberly Wade, like Stephen Lindsay, lots of researchers who do research specifically on complex false memories. Now, what's startling about these complex false memories is that you can convince people, for example, that they took a hot air balloon ride that never happened, that they were attacked by an animal, that they met Prince Charles, that they shook hands with Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. You can convince people of all kinds of things, some of which are impossible. Alien abductions. Watching a gargoyle come to life. I mean, we go from plausible to impossible memories, and it doesn't seem to particularly matter how plausible it is to you, as long as you believe that we know something about your life that you don't, and you do imagination exercises with us. So in these studies, what we do is we use essentially the idea that memory is a social construction, and that you can take pieces of memories, and I can give you pieces of my memories. And in a social situation, I can convince you, through imagination in particular, that things that you imagined actually happened. So by repeatedly picturing an event happening, you can think that it actually did. So here's my stuff. There we go. So here's an example of how this works. You're a participant. You come into my study. You know that I've previously contacted an informant. I've sent them a questionnaire about your life. About 6 years ago, I want to know what happened. I want to know that you didn't ever have any contact with the police. You didn't experience any of my target events. And I need to know the name of your best friend and where you were living at the time. Now you come in, you know that I've sent out this questionnaire, so I have some street cred, if you will. I have some background. You know I have some background on you. And we start, and you come in and you say, and I say, well, here's the first memory this informant reported happening. And you say, OK, yeah, I remember that. And you tell me for 20 minutes about this emotional memory that happened 6 years ago. Then I say, there's this other memory. Now, in this case, you're 20-year-old college students. But I say, OK, when you were 14 years old, the informants say that you assaulted someone with a weapon and the police called your parents. It happened with your best friend in the fall, and you were in your hometown when it happened, with the name of the hometown. And people go, what are you talking about? And I go, OK, well, no, that's fine. Do you need a minute? Faking empathy is always great in these studies. No, it's fine. Just you need a minute. No? OK, well, how about we try this imagination exercise? Close your eyes and picture yourself at the age of 14. You're in your hometown. You're with your best friend. Easy things to picture. Now, slowly, you go, OK, well, I can picture what that could be like. And so you start to generate details. And those details, I then reinforce, and I go, good, looks like it's really coming back. Now, if you come back 2 more times, 2 more interviews, and it sort of sits in between, you can, by the end of it, come to believe that you actually committed this crime that never happened. Never mind that you didn't do, but that never happened at all. And you can tell me why you were there. You tell me all these things that you pictured. Because I'm getting you to think that you're accessing this hidden memory, you think that you're uncovering it. And so you're incriminating yourself. You're falsely confessing. And this, again, of course, has major implications for the justice system. And that's an extreme form of memory hacking. And yes, it's ethically cleared. Yes, I'm very conscious of the rights and responsibilities of a researcher in this setting. And they are extensively debriefed. But I think that this really highlights the extent to which our memories can fail. I have a little video that is different from the one I showed last year. And it shows an example of implanting a small false memory into
in theory,
this person.
To download a brain and to that way make AI. And essentially the answer is no.
I'm with Motherboard, and I'm here today to meet with forensic psychologist and memory hacker, Dr. Julia Shaw. She studies false memories, which are memories that are not real, even if we're convinced that they are. And today she's going to try to implant a false memory into my brain.
I am a memory hacker, so I'm someone who intentionally distorts people's personal past. So what I do is I use the science of misremembering and a false memory to mess about with your memories and to make you think that you did things that never happened.
So if you were going to implant a false memory in someone's mind, either in the lab or in a, in a courtroom in the police office, what do you do?
So the big thing that you do is you try to get someone to confuse their imagination with their memory. So let's say I'm telling you that you committed a crime, and I say I have insider information. Your parents told me that when you were 14 years old, you stole something. If I then get you to imagine what could have been, so picture yourself at the age of 14, you're in your hometown, and I have the name of your best friend, I insert that, get you to picture all these things, I get you to do it over a couple weeks. It gets harder and harder to decipher what's your imagination and what you think is a memory that's coming back. And by the end of it, it's easy to think, oh, this actually happened.
Wow, that's terrifying. Okay, so I understand there's an experiment that we're going to do today. I have no idea what it is, but why don't you tell me what we're going to do?
So we're going to do a very small false memory experiment called the Diess-Roediger-McDermott task. So I'm going to read a list of words to you, and I'd like you to recall them back to me afterwards. So, nurse, sick, lawyer, medicine, dentist, physician, ill, patient, clinic, cure.
Wow.
So now, to make things harder, I'm going to get you to count backwards from 100 in sevens.
In sevens?
In sevens.
Oh, God.
I'm going to give you a minute to do that. So go ahead.
Okay, 100, 93, 86. Oh my God. Math has never been my strong suit.
Yeah, I think
oh
we're
my
good.
God. Okay.
So that's what we call the distractor task.
Yeah.
So now that you've been sufficiently distracted,
yeah.
I'm going to get you to recall those words back to me.
Do they have to be in order?
Nope.
Okay. Nurse, sick, lawyer, medicine, ill, doctor.
Ah! There
It
it
wasn't
is.
there?
It wasn't there. So that's what we call the lure word. That's a word that was never actually mentioned in the list, but it fits within the schema of these words. Memory is association. And so these are all concepts that are associated with each other, and most of them, if not all of them, are also associated with the word doctor.
Oh my God.
Which is why, when you recall that memory, you're almost certainly going to also recall this critical but non-mentioned word, doctor. So the implications of this are tremendous for the criminal justice system, also because they show that just because someone says something with confidence and details and multisensory elements, that is hearing, smelling, feeling, tasting, and just because they're absolutely sure that it happened, doesn't mean it actually did. They're not lying. It's their truth. And it gets even more iffy because we're so bad at detecting lies already that you can't, as an observer, tell the difference reliably between a true memory, a false memory, and a lie. I like to say that all memories are essentially false. So they're either a little bit false because we can't perceive everything in our environment, we can't possibly store everything we encounter, never mind recall it later, and some of them are entirely false, so they're
Okay, so I wanted you to see that little experiment because I think that the Diess-Roediger-McDermott task is actually really useful for understanding the fundamental aspect of what's going on here when we create false memories. So when we misremember stuff, often we're misremembering stuff that fits with what we've learned. And so I think this insight is quite useful for especially what you guys do. There we go. And now we're going to move on, now that you know that this is a thing that can happen, and that through quite easy manipulation, you can be convinced that there's these pieces of reality that didn't happen. And now we're going to use that information, and you're going to learn memory grandmaster tips. Do you guys know what a memory grandmaster is? Have you heard this term? There is a memory championship. You can become a memory grandmaster. This is a title. It's not a chess grandmaster. That is another kind of grandmaster. But it's just a memory test, essentially, where people compete. It's competitive remembering. People compete by remembering, for example, 4 decks of cards, the order of 4 decks of cards in an hour, by remembering some stupid amount of numbers and seeing how far they can go, and they have to be in sequence, by remembering faces and names in random order, so having to remember which face and which name incredibly quickly for an incredible number of faces and names. So you become a grandmaster if you achieve certain numbers of these things, and you could win at these competitions. And when you talk to memory grandmasters, which I occasionally get the pleasure of doing, they're fascinating because they pretty much reinforce some of the things that you probably know and possibly do already do, but also some other things that we don't normally do, which is why most of us aren't memory grandmasters and can't remember the names of 52 names and faces in 20 minutes. So what do they do and how does it fit with these networks that I was talking about? So to become a memory grandmaster, the first thing you need to remember is this network. Repetition is quite good for remembering things, which is why I'm showing it to you again, is activating the network and making a big network. So now we're getting to actively trying to harness the fact that we can create these big networks. So in my research, I get people to picture what things felt like, what things sounded like, what things smelled like. I use multisensory elements. I get them to picture as many details as they can. And in the end, what I'm trying to do is make a really big, complex memory that looks and feels real. But you need to be doing that, essentially, for stuff you actually want to remember as well. And so if you really want to remember something, you need to make a really big memory trace. So make information meaningful. Tell stories. Put up pictures. Make it meaningful to you, though, mostly. So if you're trying to remember something for yourself, make it meaningful. And by that, I also mean add things like make it unforgettably bright and amusing. From the words of memory grandmasters everywhere, they use pretty much exactly this idea, make it unforgettably bright and amusing. Now, what that means is you want to come up with something, ideally, super weird. So you want to come up with the most bizarre picture you can think of. You're trying to get other people to remember stuff. Think of weird examples, bizarre situations, colorful stories. Because your brain loves weird stuff. So let's say you're trying to remember, I don't know, something about crows. It doesn't really matter at this point, because you're going to remember this picture because it's a weird picture, and it's in a presentation where it doesn't really make sense. So weirdness can be whatever makes sense to you. There's a researcher who does some research on virtual reality. Here's an example that I read a study on the way here, and I said, this is a really interesting study for people who are interested in technology and learning and memory. Now, the study is by a person called Eric Legg. Now, Eric Legg, I'm really bad with names. Why can I remember Eric Legg's name? I'll tell you about the study in a minute. Think about a mnemonic, a memory aid, memory technique you might use to remember the name Eric Legg. Maybe you know a person named Eric. Picture him, sure. Do you know South Park? It's an animated TV show. I think of Eric Cartman, which is a bizarre character already, with very sexy legs. And that works for me. And it's weird, and it's a bit, well, visceral. So there's an emotional component. There's memory champions who remember all of the things in their extensive things they need to remember as memory champions with lewd images. They just remember everything having sex. And so it's a weird image. It has emotion. It's going to make a bigger memory trace. It's going to help for that person. Whatever works for you is what makes sense here. But the weirder, the better. And so you want to pick pieces of things that you already have in your memory, of people you know, of celebrities, of objects, of colors, and you string them together in a way that makes a weird picture. You can draw a weird picture. It doesn't really matter. Now, Eric Legg, he did a study on memory palaces, which I will get to soon. And he talked about how just because something's in virtual reality as opposed to not virtual reality, we assume that because you've actually experienced something, you're in this room, for example, that means that you're making multisensory memories, and it does. Because you're currently feeling things and hearing things and tasting things and moving around. And that means that all of those different things are being stored in all of the different parts of the brain that are responsible for you being able to recall those pieces of information later. And when you activate that network, you're activating all those pieces, those multisensory pieces, which is great. But it turns out you don't actually need to experience any of them to still have the effect of having a big network in the brain. And so you can make a multisensory memory just by picturing multisensory things, and this is what Eric Legg found, just by being in virtual reality, by picturing through an aid, by doing things with aids. You can have essentially the same effect, where you can make complex memories where you're moving around and you're experiencing things, or at least you're tricking your brain into thinking you've done so. So your brain loves multisensory memories. Your brain also loves space. And this is where Eric Legg comes in again, and where the memory champions come in. They say, OK, every time I need to remember a number or a word or a name, I make it as weird as possible. But I don't just stop there. I don't just have Eric Cartman with his sexy legs. I also have him in a place, because I don't just need to remember that one name. I need to remember loads of names, and I need to remember loads of information. And so I create, which is something I hope all of you have heard of, the method of loci. I create a memory palace. Because memories love space, and space is a separate sensation from other emotions and things that we have, other feelings. Space has a separate functionality. There are actual place cells in the brain that are responsible just for encoding where things are in relation to one another. And that's separate from your explicit ability to remember what's actually there. So there's this magical thing in our brain that says place and space matters. And so creating a memory palace by, let's say, remembering what your house looks like, walking through the front door, you're tripping over something, you've got Eric in the front room with his legs, you've got another name with some other mnemonic you've used, something weird and visual, there's oranges, there's stuff happening all over the place. You're walking through your house, though, to remember the order in which these things need to be remembered and to put them into a context. So memory champions use this technique almost universally. They create memory palaces. And this is a really old technique. This is not something that's new. But turns out, back to Eric Legg, in VR, as of 2012 at least, you can put people into VR where they have a space that they walk around, and you can say, this is now your memory palace for this kind of information. In other words, you're training people, and you're saying, I really want people to remember these particular pieces in this particular order. Let's say maybe an emergency procedure, or how to do something, and there's a sequence. Now you say, potentially, I'm going to put you into a game environment where you're walking around a space, either in virtual reality or just, this was Half-Life 2 that they used for this. It doesn't have to be your own game. You can do The Sims, just walking around. It doesn't really matter what it is. They're moving around in this room. And then what you say is, this is your space where you can now put your memories. It's like a storehouse, a warehouse for your memories. And it works. And it doesn't matter at all that the people haven't actually physically been anywhere. What seems to matter is that their brains have been tricked into just remembering the space and walking around the space and looking at the space, even though they weren't there. So virtual reality and technology can help you sort of update, give 21st century updates to old memory techniques that we've been using for a really long time. And research supports their efficacy, which is nice. So space is important, weirdness is important. And that's pretty much it in terms of what memory champions say you need. You can go on and say, stories are great. Yeah, well, stories are great because they give you weird pictures and associations and relationships. You can say, oh, yeah, but repetition, yeah, to some extent is good. Even better if it's weird, right? Even better if it's spaced. Even better if there's a narrative. And so you can fit everything when it comes to memory and remembering better seems to, in some way, if it's a memory aid, fit within these two basic things. So here's an application. So you're training people and they need to remember stuff, hypothetically. You're educators, let's say. You're educating someone. You're teaching someone something new. You want them, not just you want them to create as much as possible. Let's encourage, make people be creative. Get them to draw these weird associations. Get them to think about with each other, maybe, how weird they can make it, what their memory palace might look like, what they might use, where they might put things. Get people, for things that you really want them to remember, to make big memory traces, big networks that are as multisensory as possible. And not only are you then harnessing the fact that paying more attention to something means you're going to remember it better, putting more energy into something means you're going to remember it better, all of which you're doing when you're getting people to come up with creative image exercises, for example. And you're harnessing this multisensory network. So it's sort of a trifecta of getting people to maximize their ability to remember stuff. So make people creative and utilize that. So get creative. And less is more. You really do want to get people to just remember the take-home messages, the main things that you want to say. Overwhelming people with information makes people go to sleep, and their brains shut off, and they're no longer able to create the same way. So try to minimize the amount of information you're giving people, also so that you don't overload their short-term memory. Their memory of, well, things for about 30 seconds, where you can only keep things in your mind at once for a limited amount of time. And if you overload that, people aren't paying attention. They're not able to comprehend what you're even telling them, potentially. So less is more when it comes to this kind of information, and especially the critical stuff that you need people to remember. So technology, VR is helpful. I also am very much in favor of technology in general. So as someone who, there's always questions afterwards about, well, what about social media? Or is our current, is our Generation Y or Z or whatever you want to call it, the millennials, are they remembering fewer things? Are their brains worse? Are their memories worse? And my answer is probably not. But they're doing it differently. And they are remembering fewer facts, for example, because they don't have to. And I think this is important to take into a training environment. Sometimes we need to realize, why should they? If you know where information is located, often that's more useful than knowing exactly in its specific detail what the information is. So I think as educators or as people who train other people or even for ourselves, we need to acknowledge that it's not just about getting people to memorize lots of stuff. It's about saying, no, I'm going to give you the tools so that you can find the right information when you need it, and you can access it then. So utilize the fact that people have smartphones, that they have Twitter, that they have Instagram, that they have whatever they have, computers where they can put stuff, the internet where they can search stuff. This external brain is super helpful, and I think that we should move away from this sort of warehouse of memory, I mean, beyond the idea of a memory palace, but of trying to cram information in and instead say, no, I'm going to give you the tools to critically appraise information and to find it when you need it. Which means you still need to teach them keywords. They still need to know this information exists. But it doesn't mean that it means they don't need to necessarily remember all the details. So where information is kept, there's some fun studies on this that show that if you get people to remember facts, or try to get them to remember facts, and you give them either, you put people into two groups randomly. The first group you tell, you need to remember these facts, full stop. The second group you say, you need to remember these facts, but by the way, they're also on this folder on your desktop, which you can't access, but they're there. Who do you think performs better in terms of remembering? Well, in terms of remembering the facts, the people who aren't told that there's a folder they can access later remember more. But the people who are told there's a folder generally remember the specific subfolders where that information is stored. So they're remembering where the information is rather than what the information is. And the researchers were arguing that maybe this is more important, and maybe this is where we're headed. So where information is kept might be more important than what the information actually is, or as you might say, to remember this, location, location, location. Right? So not just in terms of memory palaces, but also location in terms of where, earmarking things. Where can I find this, not what exactly is it? And the last thing I'm going to tell you in terms of really, really, really remembering something, if you're going, no, but I can't possibly, I witnessed a crime, I need to get these details right. There's this really important quote, this really important thing my manager said to me, this really important thing that happened. My anniversary. I need to write it down because guess what? You never know for sure whether or not your memory isn't tricking you. Your memory can always be hacked. It can always be hijacked by social processes and misinformation. And something called your prospective memory. Your prospective memory is your ability to remember, or your ability to remember stuff in the future. It's the idea that I'll remember to blah, cancel my subscription. I'll remember this later. I don't need to write that down. It seems like such a basic tip. When I tell this to military, they are often shocked. They're like, what do you mean? What do you mean you need to write things down? What do you mean you're not writing things down? When you talk to people, this is so obvious, and yet it's often not practiced. And this is where we get ourselves into trouble of, I'll remember that later. But your prospective memory is overconfident most of the time. Your prospective memory is consistently tricking you into thinking it's really good at its job. And it's really not. And so next time you need to remember something really important, think of me and go, no, I probably won't remember that. And even if I do remember it, I might misremember it and get it wrong. So write it down as soon as you can if it's really important. Ideally by hand, but in general, just put it anywhere. Also, again, the external brain isn't vulnerable to the same social processes as your physical brain. A memory scientist like me can't go into your notes and hack them the same way as I can your flexible, imagination-filled brain. It's an independent piece of evidence, and that can be really, really useful and necessary sometimes. So the three things I want you to remember from my talk. One, your memory is supposed to fail. Don't get upset with yourself when it fails. It's supposed to do that. It's supposed to optimize, and that's okay. It's also these networks that you need to remember. You're trying to remember stuff. You're trying to get other people to remember stuff. Make big networks. Weirdness, creativity, space. Use space. And record important stuff. So if it's really important, make sure you write it down or record it somewhere. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions, let me know.
So I'm hoping we've got a microphone in the room, up at the back there. So has anyone got any questions for Julia? What questions have you got about memory? You wave your hands. Got one over there. Great. Is that Susie? Yes.
Yeah, you said about to remember something, write it down.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make a difference then if you, and you mentioned handwriting it, does it make a difference if you're using a pen and paper as to using a tablet, for example?
It does. So research shows that writing things physically by hand does increase your retention of that information. Now, you could argue that this is probably because it's making a more multisensory memory. You're doing more physically when you're writing something than if you're typing it. But when you don't have pen and paper, I'd still say if it's important, obviously it's still better than nothing. But for your actual ability to remember that information independently, yes, writing it down by hand is better. And drawing things, or again, sort of expanding on those things is even better. I often do this. In talks, I'm often sitting there just, it looks like I'm being really rude and doodling, but I'm visualizing things as they're being said because it maximizes my ability to, well, process what's going on.
Got one up the back.
Hello, Julia. Yeah, it's Andy.
Ah.
Hi there. Yeah, just a quick question. Do you find different types of people are more susceptible to having the misinformation gleamed on them? A bit like, I think, sort of like hypnotism. People are more susceptible, different types, and can you tell those people apart?
It's a great question. There are individual differences in vulnerability to creating false memories. There are people, for example, children often are more compliant. So they're more likely to go along with the situation. So if you ask them leading questions, they're likely to follow along, go, oh yeah, I remember that. The same thing goes for people who are bad at identifying sort of reality versus things I just experienced, just imagined. So people with certain mental disorders, perhaps like schizophrenia, positive hallucination symptoms. People who maybe have paranormal beliefs are also more vulnerable. So if you have beliefs that other people don't, where some people might argue that's probably not real, and is just in your head or is just imagined, there's some correlation there as well with vulnerability to accepting information in these kinds of settings. Hypnotizability as well. So being able to be hypnotized, which ties in with compliance and suggestibility as well, makes you more vulnerable. That being said, I am always very cautious about that question because it's easy to say, this wouldn't happen to me. Don't be that person because you're wrong. All of us are able to form false memories. All of us have false memories. Remember those HSAMs I was talking about and those super recognizers I was talking about? Oh, we've done some really fun studies with them about false memories. Turns out they experience the effects of false memories pretty much the same way as we do. If they come into a study on false memory and you come into a study, I'm going to assume most of you aren't HSAMs, you come into a study on false memories, your rates overall will be about the same in terms of accepting misinformation I've presented to you. You come in and I say, we're going to talk about your memory of 9/11, of footage, watching footage on TV. I make up some footage that didn't exist. Now I posit it to the HSAMs and say, what do you remember about this footage? They don't know I'm making it up. And I give it to the people who aren't HSAMs. But 40% of both will say, oh yeah, I remember that footage and here's what it looked like. So it doesn't prevent you from forming false memories. It just means that you happen to have a better, more stable network of stuff that you experience. But on top of that, you still have this vulnerability. So as far as I know, there is yet to be a person who is completely resistant to false memories. And I think that's because that's how memory works. Your memory is supposed to be flexible and update. So individual differences, yes. But mostly the take-home message there is this is how your brain works, and it can happen to everybody.
Another question somewhere? We've got one down here. I'm going to sneak one in while we're getting there. Julia, with sort of the technology we've got to rely on in terms of perhaps storing information, is there any evidence that we are becoming more forgetful, our memories are declining, or maybe getting better?
Not that I know of. Again, I think it's just changing. So I think the way that we remember is changing. I think we're utilizing technology, which I think we should. And we're able to also maybe focus on things that are actually important to us, not just things that we think we should know. So I might think that, oh, it's useful at some points to know the capitals of all the countries of the world, but I don't really need that information most of the time. And so knowing where I can find that is still going to free up resources so I can pay attention to other stuff and learn other things. So I don't need to spend my days trying to remember all the cities. I can spend my days learning science or other things.
So my comment is aligned to that, because I'm just wondering, I agree with that part, but I'm just wondering, your statement that facts become less important, I would like to debate. Because I actually think that in this era of information overload, facts are more and more important. I think knowledge is critical, like to be able to judge all the information that is available to us.
But there's a bit of a difference. So I don't mean facts aren't important as in the truth doesn't matter. I'm not endorsing Trump. If that's what you heard me say. I'm Canadian, by the way, not American. But what I meant there is that, so I agree, but I think what we need to be teaching people is critical appraisal. So we need to teach people how to assess whether or not information is good and reliable. You do need some knowledge, and you still need to learn things. So the memory techniques and things I was showing you, they don't replace learning as a whole. And you do need to know some basic things, at least sort of concepts, basic concepts. But it does free up the space for all these sort of sideline stuff. And I think it does make you more able to appreciate, well, the fundamental stuff that isn't, again, the specific names of cities, for example. So with facts, too, it's tricky because we're bombarded with so many new facts every day, or things that call themselves facts. And so those are things that you can't know. You can't know the answer to new things. And so you need to be able to, in the moment, make the assessment. Your previous knowledge might give you a bit of a guidance, but it's often not going to give you the answer. And so there, again, it's about understanding what good information looks like, where it comes from, what evidence is, what sort of replicability is, falsifiability, all these sort of scientific concepts that are deeper. And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, because that's how we get around the misinformation that's spewed by so many sources right now.
Go on over there.
Hi.
Oh, well.
One of the things that I sort of find in life, and I'm sure this isn't uncommon, is that every now and then I'll smell a smell or I'll taste something and it triggers a memory. It's something that's stuck there, it's locked in there somewhere, but I can't attach it to anything visual. I know it's a memory, but I don't know what it was in my life that it was from, but it's there. And it's interesting what you're saying about the false memory sort of element in what you were talking about. Are there memories locked up that aren't visual that you can actually still access? Is there any science behind that at all?
There is. So there's a couple pieces there. Because the first piece is that a lot of what we do, we don't really know why we do it. So quite often we'll make a decision, and afterwards, if you look at Daniel Kahneman's work, behavioral economics was touching on this a lot, with the idea that sort of you make a decision, and then after the decision you're asked, why did you make that decision? And essentially most of us sort of make something up, because we don't really know why we do the things we do much of the time. And so it's a post hoc evaluation, which suggests that there's other factors that are influencing our decision making, and it's certainly not just logic, because we do a lot of things that are not very logical as humans. And they're not very predictable either. So we're, as individuals certainly, behavioral economics have for a long time had difficulty predicting what an individual will do, even if you have all the information and say, well, but this is the logical thing to do. So there's that. So there's certainly memories and pieces of memories and experiences that influence our lives. But, and this is where there's two warnings here. One is, if you have a smell and you don't know where it's from, that certainly, it can just be a piece of a memory without the network. You've lost the rest of the network, or maybe the rest of the network was never formed properly in the first place. You just have smell, positive. Smell, I like this. Smell my childhood, right? You don't need those other pieces necessarily, and they could just be gone. And what I would warn you to not do is to think, ooh, there must be a memory here. I just need to find it. Because that's where you get into dangerous territory, where you start maybe confabulate. You start thinking, what could this be from? Why might I have done this? And guess what you start doing? You start doing what's called auto-suggest. You do what I do to you, but to yourself. So you are starting to implant a false memory by using your imagination to fill in the blanks that you can't remember. We see this with dementia patients and Alzheimer's patients quite clearly, where we want clear narratives. We want things to go from part A to part B to part C and to make sense and to fit together in our lives. As soon as you start missing pieces, it's quite easy for humans to just spontaneously make stuff up that fills in the blank and explains how you moved from somewhere to somewhere else, why you're now doing this, or why you're talking to this person, even if it's just made up. So it's easy for the human brain to fill in the blanks with imagined things. And then the problem is that later on, when you smell this, you go, oh yeah, that's because of this thing that I experienced, which you may have just confabulated or created on your own. So be careful looking for those memories. In terms of repression, as a psychoanalytic concept, the idea that your memory can hide things, like negative things, trauma from you, I don't endorse that concept. But that's for another day, maybe.
Hi.
Hi.
With reference to the study where the participant declared that the doctor was in the list when in fact it was not, where do we draw the line between inference and memory? And I guess this question also is linked to education in general, because we're delivering facts, but we don't necessarily expect all the facts to be there, but to actually help them to infer some certain things.
Okay, so inferences are, I would argue, the step one often towards a false memory. So you could say, spontaneously inferred or just spontaneously created a memory of this word. It's difficult to say just by looking at it. But the thing is that what we see with these sorts of experiments, where they're quite simple, maybe they're a bit more complex sometimes as well, we're getting people to, did you bounce the ball, or did you look at the ball, or did you, do something else, or did you eat this food, or look at this food? So we do not just words, also experiences and things. But what we see is that the problem is that once that's spontaneously been inferred, is that the next time you remember that that was the case rather than that you inferred that. And so this is what I always warn people about, that, again, you move from the maybe this happened or this could have happened to this did happen, because you forget that piece. And so that's where it turns into a memory, because it feels like you're remembering something that happened rather than just think, oh, this makes sense. And so the inference, I think, often can lead to false memories. It doesn't have to, but I think it's an easy path. For teaching people to make inferences, so sort of how to think about things, to make the right kinds of inferences, you can harness that. You can still say, sort of, here's this network, if you want people to make certain kinds of decisions repeatedly. It's not an application I've thought about very much, because it's sort of intentionally inferencing, which isn't, inferencing, is that a word? But intentionally creating inferences is not something I do personally in terms of a benefit to memory. I just study it as a negative right now. So I'm not sure what the exact answer is in terms of how to utilize it best to get people to make the right kinds of inferences.
Oh, there's somebody else down the front here.
Yeah, is there a memory capacity?
Is there a memory capacity? Can your memory be full?
Yeah,
Is your memory full?
I've got an employee that believes that I'm going to teach him something new, he's got to let something else go.
No. Luckily, that's not the case. You don't need to push other stuff out to push new stuff in. As far as we know, your memory probably, or your brain has an infinite capacity. But the thing that it doesn't have is an infinite capacity for attention and reinforcement. So if you're spending time learning new stuff, what you're not doing often is reinforcing old stuff, because you're spending all your time doing new stuff. And so those connections can fade, and they can recombine with things in ways that are inappropriate. So that's where the time is important, the time you're spending doing things or memorizing things. But the idea that your brain can be full is a myth. So you can tell him that. Julia says your brain is not full.
Any other questions?
Yeah, one over here. So you might have touched on this with your comment about trauma earlier. So you were talking about implanting memories, but what if somebody has either a real traumatic one or a not real thing that just haunts them? Do people try and kind of help them cover those memories up, or do something to sort of change existing memories?
Yeah, I was talking yesterday to therapists who deal with trauma patients, and this is the same place where I had the self-identified HSAM who's like, oh my God, I'm not alone. But they were saying that a lot of therapy, especially PTSD therapy, utilizes this idea that we're trying to reprogram or restructure a memory, and you're trying to make it less terrible. And research does show that that's a thing that you can do. You can do it invasively. You can do it directly in mouse brains. So you can go right into a brain and essentially cut off the emotional piece of a memory. which is what matters, because there's nothing inherently traumatic to a situation or a memory. It's the emotion that makes it terrible for you as an individual. So that is something that is done. That's something that's done actively in therapy. It's cognitive restructuring is often the word for that, or reframing, or there's lots of other words. But certainly that is a thing that people try to do. So it's sort of the opposite of creating a false memory, right? You're taking stuff away. And you can also restructure. So this is where there's some potential research applications for making people just actually remember it, not just take away the emotional piece, but actually change the way that they remember something happening entirely, so that it has a more positive spin or outcome. Haven't done that yet. Ethically, I think also get into difficult territories there, but certainly potential applications. We've also implanted positive memories of food. It's like asparagus. Remember that time you loved asparagus? That's something we've done as well. So sort of helping people with like essentially selling things. So the advertising industry has known this for a long time. Making associations where there are none. That's what advertising is. And that's utilizing the same idea that you're connecting things that aren't normally connected. You're sort of creating false memories of, ooh, this makes me feel happy. Why? Well, because you've been sold this network that doesn't exist. So advertising knows this, and they do essentially try to create false memories. And the good old days, back to Trump, hey? Remember the good old days? Yeah, they probably didn't exist. But if you think about sort of what people tell us, the stories, the way that they reframe them, everything was magical. And we need to be careful with that rhetoric, because what they're doing is they're changing the way that we remember things. They're potentially distorting things in a false narrative way.
Have we got any more? One over there.
Do you find that you get skeptics who are harder to implant memories into or to work with, that are kind of hardwired into thinking this isn't going to work, and therefore you get a self-fulfilling prophecy almost?
So I feel like you're identifying as, this wouldn't happen to me. I'm skeptical, I'd know better. Not as far as I know. I didn't test skepticism. I did test personality characteristics. I tested for compliance, suggestibility, fantasy proneness, and other features. I don't think so. I also think that intelligence puts you at risk. Now, the reason I think that intelligence makes you more likely to create false memories, which isn't not something I've directly tested. This is a hypothesis. But I think that it puts you at more risk because you're better at imagining possible scenarios. You're more able to create something that makes sense in your narrative that fits with what I've just told you. So as long as you believe me, you can use your brilliant imagination, your intelligent deduction to make a super plausible story, possibly better than someone who's less intelligent. So I think that intelligence puts you at risk. Skepticism, I think knowing that false memories exist is really good, because if someone starts asking you leading questions or starts getting you to picture things that didn't actually happen, you might go, stop. I know that this can create false memories. I don't want to engage with this. And I think that's the best protection you have as an individual. But you need to know what's happening in that particular situation. And most often we don't know that. And so even in my study, they thought they were coming in for an emotional memory study. They thought that they were uncovering these emotional memories that were actually there. And people came in with textbooks, like Saul Kassen's textbook. Saul Kassen is one of the leading experts on false confessions. They came in, plopped the textbook, it's not going to work. It worked. And I think there's also an overconfidence effect there, potentially, where people go, I know what this looks like. And as long as you give them a plausible, no, it's eyewitness stuff. It's related to other things. Oh, fine. And then they still fall for it. So education isn't necessarily going to protect you, but I think it can make you more cautious, and I think that's really important in preventing these things from happening.
Got any more down the front? Okay, well, this is an L&D conference, so I think we should ask you what you've learned from this session today. So take 2 minutes to chat with the person next to you and just say, what have you learned from doing this? How is that going to affect you back in your role?
Yeah.
Down here?
Yeah. What I've learned is that learning should be fun, but it is also hard work, because then it lasts longer, the memory lasts longer.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really important one. And I would also slightly argue with fun, and I would call it enjoyable, because some people don't like fun. I know it's weird, but I work with some scientists, I'm sorry, Julia, and they don't want to do fun, but they don't mind enjoyable. But it is hard work. I think that's completely true, isn't it?
Yeah, yesterday I was talking to a student who came up to me after a talk, and he's like, how do I study better? Essentially, how do I do better on my exams is what he wanted. And I said, well, you know, you can use all these techniques. He's like, oh, but those sound hard. It sounds like a lot of work. That's the point. You're investing time and energy into doing this, and it's going to make it stick.
Another reflection?
Just for me, the big one is to write things down. The question I then have is, how am I going to remember what's going to be my trigger to say, right, there's something I've got to, because I forget stuff all the time. So it's, you know, knowing that, you know, writing things down by hand is going to be more effective. Drawing pictures is going to be even more effective, and that's probably going to be the thing that I'll try and change. How can I visually make things more memorable and then start to build a habit?
Good.
One more? Oh, we've got two more. Go on.
Yeah. I think I'll use more of this weird stuff that you were mentioning, you know, in the materials. So it's going to be, I don't know whether it's going to be fun, but it's going to increase the appetite to listen more. You know, what's the explanation behind this crow on the tongue? So, you know.
So you're going to use more weird stuff.
I will, yes.
We'll come and chat to you later on. And last over there.
My favorite final comment, who am I? How do I know what I can trust? That's good skepticism right there.
Oh, we've got one more.
Do you work with the educational authorities to try and identify how they can actually impart some knowledge better to people based on the way that they actually memorize?
I'm working on with the BIT is like a think tank in London, and they do work with the government on big education programs and stuff. And we're right now trying to get into teach 10-year-olds how to remember stuff, some meta memory. So just a few things about how their memory works, because I know that that's not happening, because by the time they get to university, they don't know any of this stuff. And so either it's gotten lost somewhere, or the students I happen to see don't know this, or it's just not part of education in this way. And I think that knowing specifically that your memory isn't work, it can be broken, this is what we need. They're basic things. This isn't very complicated at this level. And I think it's still incredibly useful. And I think 10-year-olds especially are going to be great at getting in the habit of being creative, of picturing things, of making things weird, and then they have that skill forever. So I think that's something I'm keen to do, but is difficult to get into.
There's just a question that we were discussing. When you dream, how much do we pull from memories, and how much do we invent, and how much do we impart to the other one?
So dreaming is important for what's called consolidation. So dreaming is important for making sure your memories stick. So if you want to remember your vacation, make sure you're getting enough sleep, for example, because you're not consolidating. You're not setting down those memories into permanent, longer-term memories if you're not sleeping. Beyond that, no idea. We're definitely drawing on memories. They do get replayed. You can see them. You can physically see them get reactivated. And then it's the networks that happen to be connected with them that seem to also be activated, and that seems to be what we call dreaming. But we're not really sure what dreaming is or why we remember it ever. And you're not supposed to remember it. So if you say, I don't remember my dreams, well, you're not supposed to. You're supposed to be able to differentiate things you experienced and things you dreamt. But beyond that, we don't know. The great mystery, dreams.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Julia for a really fascinating talk today. I think it's got us all thinking, and now we have to go home and remember all the stuff we've learned over the last 2 days. So there'll have to be lots of drawing and thinking and weird ideas. So can we give Julia a big round of applause, please?